Hey guys, Chris here. Today we have a story about two fishermen who go to remote northern Minnesota in the Superior National Forest, and there they run into something that is unknown and extremely frightening, and it turns out it ends up following them. That's next. Okay, so our story takes place in northern Minnesota, June of 2017, and this is where Doug and his good friend Ron would regularly do fishing trips, and they would get the maps out and they would find a new location and go to these pretty remote areas where they would bring their canoe and they would portage in and then bring it from one lake to the next and find these fishing spots. And they really were excited about this new location called Stub Lake. And they came in on this Fernberg Road. And I looked this up on the map and I found this Fernberg Road. And they went to this Stub Lake. And they had to portage their gear into Stub Lake. And portage means simply you're carrying your gear, your watercraft, from one lake to another and the shortest distance between those two lakes, or you're going around an obstacle like, say, a waterfalls, and you're coming down the river and there's a waterfall, so you would take your gear out, your canoe, and you would carry it around the waterfalls and then put in below the falls and continue on. And that's how they used to do it in the old days when the French trappers came through Ontario, northern Minnesota, and now in the Boundary Waters, that's how they travel from lake to lake in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. Ron and Doug got their gear off of this Fernberg Road, through the forest, onto this Stub Lake, and then they worked their way to the opposite end of the lake and got onto this creek that connected to Fall Lake. And I saw this on the map. You could see this creek winding through the wilderness, and then it connects to this Fall Lake. And their route along the creek had a lot of obstructions, a lot of debris in the way, so it took them some time to follow this creek and move the deadfall and pick up and go over rocks. But they worked their way along this creek and they got to this southwest end of Fall Lake and started fishing, and they did pretty well. They caught northern and brook trout, having a lot of fun, and their goal was to make a camp there and then fish from that point at the mouth of this creek out onto this Fall Lake. Really good sized lake, and it had this big island on it, and the island was so thick with trees it looked like somebody pulled a barge of trees in the middle of this lake and then just anchored it right there, because just a bunch of trees just sticking out of the middle of the island, it looked like, because it was right up to the shoreline. Now, this part of northern Minnesota, the forest is very dense, very thick, and they always told someone where they were going and when they were going to return, because if anything ever happened to them, medical emergency or an injury, they would most likely not even be found because it's so thick and it's just so remote up there. And so they always did that. It's a good thing to remember to do. They got to this Fall Lake, had their camp set up, and they started fishing around the lake, the shoreline of the lake, and then they went around this large island and started catching fish. And they were really enjoying the day. And that night, they took their catch, cooked it over the fire. Stars were out. It was just a beautiful night. We're just having a great time. The next morning, they got up very early. They're excited to just fish right from their camp. They're onto this Fall Lake. Creek's behind them. And about 7:30 in the morning, they were casting from shore, and they heard in the forest behind them, in the thick forest, a loud tree knock. Just this crack, just startled them, both of them. And at first, Ron thought, did a a large branch fall onto another one, just some kind of a natural sound. And then about 10 minutes later, it happened again, this loud tree crack, tree knock. And again, it startled them, and they knew, okay, there's something out there, there's somebody out there doing this. And then they had this feeling of being watched. And they weren't sure what that really meant, but they felt like they were being watched. And obviously with some sound, there was something out there, and they didn't know what to make of it. They continued to listen. They didn't hear any more of these tree knocks. And they decided to continue to fish. And Ron remembers he cast towards the island and started retrieving his line. And as he looked up towards the island, he saw this large black thing step out of the forest from the island and come out of the forest onto the shoreline of this small bay, and it started to walk into the water. This was about 100 yards away from them. And they were both astounded by how large this thing appeared. And at first they're thinking, is that a bear? But it was upright on 2 feet, and it just casually walked into the water. And then it was thigh, waist, chest, armpits. And it continued into the water, away from them, heading towards the shore, where they were down this way on the shore, observing this thing entering the water. And it looked like it started dog paddling at one point because they saw a wake behind it. And they proceeded to watch this for 5 minutes or so. And as they watched it, it would go underwater and disappear. Then it would come back up. And it looked like it was either dog paddling or swimming. And it continued on a long ways from the island to the mainland of this fall lake. And they watched it. And as it got nearer to the shore, they could see it was clearly walking now. And it started to reveal itself in the reverse order: armpits, chest, waist, thigh, as it walked out of the water and got on the shore. And then it suddenly stopped and turned around. And they weren't sure if it was looking at them or looking in their direction. They just saw this shape just standing there for a good 20 seconds. And then it just quickly turned and disappeared into the forest. Now, this was about 250 yards away because it was moving across this channel and it came out into the forest. And it was moving in the opposite direction from where they were. And they're thinking it probably didn't see them because they were under this canopy of trees right at the shoreline. It was pretty dark there. It was early morning still. And so they made note of where it went into the forest. And they remember that area and that part of the lake. It's so dense and so thick that you could be in there and something could be 5 feet away from you and you wouldn't even know it. And so they sat on this shoreline just waiting to see if something was going to happen, if this creature was going to come back out, maybe go back across the channel, make some noises. They heard those tree knocks earlier. And they waited on the shoreline for about 2 hours, just listening and observing, because they had some time and they did not want to run into it if they didn't have to. And about 9:30, they decided to get in the canoe and go across over to the island and kind of check out this spot where this thing came out of the forest. It appeared to be gone. They're in this bay where this thing came out of the forest on this island, and they were there the day before and they were fishing and they didn't see or hear anything. And Ron takes the canoe paddle and he's put it in the water where he saw this thing come in, and he couldn't even touch the bottom of the lake there. And this thing was just at like waist deep. at this point. He couldn't even touch the canoe paddle. It was a 4-foot long canoe paddle. And they continued to test different areas to see how big this thing was. And then they went closer to shore where they saw it clearly just past its thighs, and they could finally touch bottom. And it was, the canoe handle was just barely sticking out of the water, so they guesstimated this thing was 9, maybe even 10 feet tall. Just massive. And from their vantage point on the other side of the lake, looking at the island, it looked huge, but it was hard to gauge until they went over there. They continued to paddle around, and they moved kind of to the left side of the island, facing the island, and they looked into the trees, and they could see something had made a trail through the brush coming out onto this shoreline of the island. And it was parted and broken in such a way it looked like a rhino trail in Africa, like something big had been passing in and out of this location. They were just awestruck by what they had seen and how huge it was turning out to be. And they were facing the island in the canoe, listening, observing, just trying to make sense of what they had seen. And then they heard behind them on the mainland this, kind of off in the distance, this whooping sound. Whoop, whoop. Kind of like that, but really loud. And they both turned their heads, didn't see anything, and then they now had this realization that they were being observed. And whatever this creature was on the same side of the land that they had their camp on. And they had to make a decision. Were they going to leave and try to get as far out as they could away from this lake? And they knew they could only go so far because once nightfall came, they couldn't portage at night. It was just too dangerous to be on slippery rocks in this creek, portaging and dragging the canoe around this creek to this Stub Lake to get out of there. So they knew they were going to have to spend a night out there somewhere with this creature. And that prospect made them feel very afraid. They were, according to Ron, shaking in their boots. And they both had handguns. And he had this idea of when you're up against a situation, you have this idea of how you would respond to it. And it's usually in this noble fashion of dealing with the situation, especially if you have guns. But they didn't feel any of that. They just felt they were over their heads with whatever this creature was and their situation. So they got back to this creek as it came into this fall lake, packed up their tent and their gear, and proceeded to wrap around this creek and work their way towards the Stub Lake. And it was taking them a long time, and they were running out of daylight. And they knew they were going to have to make a camp somewhere along this creek. Very thick forest. It's not what they wanted to do, but at least they were heading in the right direction. As they stopped, got out, and were looking for a location to set up their new camp, they heard another whoop sound to the southeast of them. Again, kind of off in the distance, kind of faint, but they clearly heard this whooping sound. And this is about 4:30 in the afternoon. About an hour and a half later, they heard another whooping sound, but this time it was to the north and west of them. And they had this thought of, okay, was this the same creature that had gone ahead and crossed the creek and now was making sound over here? Or was there another creature on the opposite side and now we are being paralleled by these two different Sasquatches? They didn't know. They had no idea except that they heard it in the opposite direction an hour plus later. They quickly made their camp, got everything set up. Both of them knew it was a good idea to get some extra firewood And they didn't think they were going to sleep hardly at all that night, if any. Got the extra firewood, had an early dinner, got the guns ready, and they're sitting on their logs just waiting. And as it got dark, they could just feel this anxiety come over them after what they'd seen, what they'd been hearing. And Ron kept checking his watch, his clock. 9:11, 11:15, 12:30, 1:15, nothing. 2:30, nothing. And then 3:10, he remembered clearly seeing 3:10, and just a few moments later, in the darkness, quite a ways away, they both heard this loud crashing sound coming straight towards their camp, coming right through the forest from behind their camp, away from the creek, coming straight towards their camp. Just startling. And they both felt they weren't going to use the guns until they saw something, and that if it was coming into the camp, they would fire. But prior to that, they're like, just hold on, we don't want to piss it off. And they listened to this thing, and it came right up within 20, 25 feet of their camp and then stopped. It was dead quiet. And they waited in the silence, listening, fires crackling, and the light is casting out to the trees and to the edge of the trees around them. And then they heard something slowly walking behind them, behind to the north of their camp, just slowly walking around their camp, back and forth, breaking branches, stepping on things. And it was just very blatant how it was obviously trying to make noise, trying to get their attention. And they thought that was really odd that it was trying to get their attention. And they just assumed that it must be just letting them know of its presence to frighten them and to make an impression that they're not supposed to be there. They got this like warning, like, do not come back here. Stay out. That was the warning they got. And they felt like, okay, whatever this thing was, it's obvious, letting us know what's out there. And it seems to be staying right at the border of the light and the forest from the campfire. And so they didn't have any assurances of that. And so they had their guns in hand, and they're just waiting and listening, continuing to feed the fire. And this proceeded to happen 4 or 5 times, where it would get really loud, this crashing, this moving around, broken branches, breaking tree limbs, and then it would be dead silent, and then it would start again. And then at one point, there was a loud tree knock that he initiated the next round of the movement in the brush. Just totally startled them, totally made them jump. And it was 3:10 when this started, and about 4:30, it continued on for another 20 minutes. And at this point, they could clearly hear things coming into the camp, small rocks, pine cones. They couldn't quite see it, but things were landing in their camp. At this point, Ron was so afraid, he had this kind of vision of something happening. And he remembered seeing this creature earlier that day coming off the island, and not sure what it was at that point, but just seeing this very long arm, 4.5, maybe longer, this big long arm swinging as it was working its way down into the water before it got into the water and essentially swam to the other side. And he envisioned this long arm reaching out of the darkness and grabbing his friend and then just dragging him off into the trees, into the darkness. Just this thought, and it just overwhelmed him. or grabbing him and just pulling him into the darkness. And they waited and listened, and the brush breaking continued. And then all of a sudden it appeared to fade off and move away from the camp. And they heard this one last loud whooping sound as it appeared to be moving away. And at this point, it was almost 5 in the morning. So from about 3:10 to about 5 in the morning, they had this disruption, this frightening experience in this camp that they're at. About 5:30, there was enough light coming up, and the daylight was starting to break, and the night was going away. And they both felt this relief. Things had been quiet for a while, and they immediately started packing up, loading up the canoe, and got the canoe back in this creek and worked their way along this creek back towards this Stub Lake. Got to the other side of the Stub Lake, ported your stuff back to the truck, and they got out of there. They were both very happy to get out of there. Now, Ron was thinking about this island, and he thought maybe there was a den or some kind of a cave or something on this island, and the Sasquatch would go back and forth, and maybe he lived in this cave on this island. Maybe there was deer that were on the island, because the deer would swim out to the island, and maybe they were easy pickings for a large Sasquatch to get a deer on the island. But they both knew that this thing was trying to ensure that they didn't come back by being so obvious with its sounds and its movements in the brush. And Ron said they did a really good job, because they did not want to come back to this location at all, ever. And they remembered seeing this thing as it came out of the water, and it was soaking wet. They could clearly see it had muscle structure that was just massive, just enormous. And it looked like a superhuman bodybuilder to them, even from that great distance of about 230 yards or so. They could clearly see this immense size of this thing and how powerful and strong that it looked. And that was what they'll always remember about their trip to Stub Lake and Fall Lake in northern Minnesota. And they know that they not only have not gone back since 2017, they know they never will go back after what had happened to them. And that is our story from Ron and Doug in the Superior National Forest of northern Minnesota. And it is very remote up there. And as you go farther north, you get into thousands of lakes, and then it gets on into Ontario, which are tens of thousands of lakes. Ontario is just loaded with lakes and lake country and vast wilderness and great fishing, and apparently Sasquatch and Bigfoot up there as well. So yeah, some great country up there in northern Minnesota. So all right, you guys, thank you for watching. I am now drinking water at this point. And I got to hike out of here, but it's been a beautiful day. I'm looking forward to getting out and doing some camping, and then a little bit of cooking, and obviously some storytelling coming up. I'm recovering from my illness and my trip to Europe. We had a great trip to Europe. A lot of fun Jeanette and I had. So, but looking forward to the whole summer ahead of me right now. And you guys watching the video, so I really appreciate that. So thank you for watching, as always, and I appreciate all the comments. If you guys like what I do, like and subscribe. And as always, keep hiking.